we're here for the panelists. And so what I thought we'd do is we'll start with Rosetta, have each of them kind of give a quick overview, give some background to them, and then we'll just dive into the questions. So Rosetta, if you'd like to go first.
I sat on the end thinking I would go last.
Oh, yeah.
I'm always good to go with the flow. My name is Rosetta Clay. My pronouns are she and her. And I will start with the titles that I love and cherish the most. I am a aunt, and I'll say auntie because that is what my 3 lovely nieces call me. I'm a daughter. My mother is here with me today. I think many of you met her. I'm also a cousin, a niece, but those are the titles that I love and cherish. But why I'm here and the passionate purpose that I have is that I'm currently a doctoral student studying diversity and equity in education with an emphasis in human resource development. And I also facilitate diversity, equity, and belonging conversations. I'm excited to be here to hear from our panelists and also you all as well.
Thanks, Rosetta. AJ, do you want?
See, I sat in the middle, right? Because I knew then, I was like, all right, I'll be in the middle. And then I know it doesn't matter which way we start. Good morning, still morning, right? Yeah, morning, okay. Very early morning, actually. So it's 11 o'clock my time, so it feels a little later in the day than it actually is, I guess. AJ Liu, use they, them pronouns. I work in academic leadership at Kent State University, which is up in Cleveland, near Cleveland, Akron, Ohio. If you're familiar with LeBron James, Akron, Ohio, right? That's where I'm at. It's about an hour south of Cleveland, so if people are familiar with Cleveland. And I work in one of the academic colleges at Kent State University as the lead diversity officer in that college. So I sort of function as a mini chief diversity officer role at the academic level, and we have 9 academic units at our university across 8 campuses. So we're a large public research institution, so a lot of my work centers on academic leadership. So I work a lot with faculty and a lot with deans and our assistant and associate deans to implement things at the school and at the college at the program level. I also work across the university then too on the 500 diversity committees that end up getting created at our institutions, right? That all have the same couple of people on them and we all do slightly different things, but all the same thing in all those diversity committees, right? So I do a lot of work across the institution as well. And then outside of my higher ed role, I serve as an independent consultant and trainer in the DEI and B space. I say DEI and B, so diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I serve as an independent consultant for a wide variety of organizations. I've worked with nonprofits, I've worked with a lot of higher education institutions, smaller schools, a lot of community colleges, some private institutions, some for-profit organizations, all the way through to like community corrections facilities and local city governments and different things. So I've done a lot of different types of consulting work and DEI and B work, and just excited to sort of bring that perspective too as we think about how all of these different areas can utilize DEI and B work effectively and what that means for us in higher education especially. So.
Chris, you're perfect. Thank you. Pleasure to be here, everyone. My name is Chris Smith. Use he, him pronouns. And I am the executive director of the College Transition Collaborative, CTC for short. CTC is a center that operates out of Stanford University. And we've been around since 2014. Our goal is to create more equitable learning environments in higher education. And we do that by bridging research and practice. So, we were founded by a group of social psychologists who wanted to apply their theory and their learning to the higher education space to create more equitable environments. So how do we work with administrators to transform these environments to make them more equitable for students? How do we focus in on social belonging for students and conveying to students that they do belong in a college environment, that some of the challenges that they will encounter are normal and solvable, and there are resources for them to actually utilize in order to help them navigate some of the challenges that they'll inevitably face in the college environment. But then our work has sort of shifted over time, where we did a lot of work sort of directly to students at first, and then really thinking about the institutional level and how do we transform institutions, how do we transform the environments that the students are operating in to create more equitable outcomes for the students who we are so interested in serving. So our work is sort of transformed, which I'll certainly talk about over our discussion. I would not consider myself a DEI expert like my colleagues.
He said that.
But the work that I really want to just convey some of the learnings from our work in higher education, and now we're translating that work into the workforce as well. And really, myself, just a little bit of background. I'm really pleased to be here. I've known Omid through our work at CTC, and it's really great. One of the most meaningful parts of this job is to be able to meet people who are actually on campus and doing the hard work, and really working with them to get the outcome that I think we're all desperate to achieve in terms of student success, and specifically for those who are structurally disadvantaged. So it's really a pleasure to be able to meet everyone who's in this space, and to just really learn from each other in this process. So thank you for having me.
I'm going to come to you first, AJ, so as you have the microphone, so we've fixed the first problem. So I'll just give a little context. I am not an expert in the D&I space. I would consider myself a historian of diversity. So that says my age. My first job out of college, I worked in what was called the Minority Affairs Office. And then it became multicultural. And then it became diversity and inclusion. And then it was diversity, inclusion, and tolerance. And then we became diversity, inclusion, and equity, or equity and inclusion. And so now we have this term belonging. And this probably reflects my age. I'm like, why do we need another word? Let's do the work. So let's start with defining belonging, and what does belonging mean?
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate being called a DEI and B expert. I do not use that term to define myself. Personally, I don't think a DEI and B expert exists. I just think that this work is purposefully transformational, and I think it's ever changing and it's ever growing. So I don't ever feel like I'm at a point where I can say, I'm an expert in DEI and B and everything there is to know about diversity, right? So I'll start there and then I'll answer your question. So belonging for me. So I know that as we think about DEI and B, right, they're all integral in the definition of belonging, in my opinion. So belonging is sort of the outcome, the objective that we're trying to achieve through really good DEI work. So diversity is all about recognizing and valuing our differences, right? And diversity isn't something that we have to believe in or not believe in. Diversity is a fact, right? Diversity just exists. We all have differences. We all have identities. We all have backgrounds. Diversity just is, right? Equity is about creating fair access to opportunities, to resources, to support services, right? And that whole sort of breakdown as you talk about, the evolution of language. We used to talk about equality a lot, right? Sameness, giving everyone the same thing. But we just finished talking about diversity and how everyone's different, right? So how can we expect every different person to need exactly the same thing in order to be successful, right? So it's not about equality anymore, it's about equity, which isn't about giving everyone the same thing, it's about giving people what they actually need in order to be successful, right? And so the equity framework, and then inclusion and belonging I usually talk about together. So for me, a lot of times the conversation stops at inclusion, and to me, inclusion just doesn't take the conversation far enough. So the way that I talk about it is inclusion is having a seat at the table, right? I've included you, right? Please come sit down with us at the table. But how many times have we been at the table and we say something and nobody listens to what we just said, right? Or we say something, no one listens, but someone 3 seats next to us says the exact same thing that we just said, and all of a sudden it's this magical, amazing idea, right? That everyone loves, like, oh, where did you come up with that, right? Inclusion, having a seat there, right? And this applies to all of us, faculty, staff, our students, right? We include them in the classroom, right? We include them in the conversation. But if I'm included at that table and I don't feel heard, I don't feel valued, I don't feel important, I don't feel like people are actually listening to my contributions and to my ideas, then I don't actually feel like I belong at that table, right? Just being included in the conversation isn't taking it far enough. And oftentimes our initiatives are DEI, right? And they stop at that inclusion piece. And a lot of times in my experience, that inclusion piece can just be very performative, right? It's not taking it to that next level where we're actually helping people believe that they belong at that table and that they are important contributing members of our community, of our organization, of the decision-making process, right? I want to feel like when I'm at that table, if I left, something would be missing from that table, right? That's true belonging, and that, I think, is really the goal. So I appreciate, what we're talking about with, why do we need to keep evolving the language, right? Isn't it just the same thing that we're talking about over and over again? But I think language needs to evolve, and I think at this point, DEI has become a buzzword, it's become a buzz phrase, inclusion has become performative, and it's time for us to evolve into new language, and belonging, I think, takes us to that next level that really helps us put our words into action.
Yeah, the only thing I will say is that oftentimes the DE and I becomes a barrier to the work, and we focus on all of that, but don't think about the outcome. I think on the table are some handouts in it, and one of the slides is about diversity is a fact, right? We're diverse by default. Everyone is different by default, but how do we become diverse by design? Like, how do we really look at intentionality and being purposeful about our diversity, and not allow that focus of, oh, we're going to be diverse, and allow that to be a barrier to the outcome, which is belonging. And so I think that, for me, is where I look at the space of, let's think about this in a more purposeful and intentional manner and not be performative, to your point.
Chris, do you want to add to that?
I think my colleagues really set the stage well. What I would just add is, in terms of the work that we've done with colleges and universities across the country, we've focused, I think belonging, just to set the stage, I think belonging has multiple layers. And we've focused on one layer of that, which is social belonging for students. So, that particularly, we've tried to address, feelings of connectedness to their peers, to their environment, to their classroom environment, as well as their overall campus environment. So that's one particular lens that we've tried to address through context-focused interventions. And that has been something that was a flagship project of our work that did show a meaningful impact on student outcomes, on focusing on that one particular layer. So that's how we have defined just that layer of belonging, but we know it's sort of there are multiple layers of it, and the context is really key in terms of creating that environment where students will feel that sense of belonging that leads to those outcomes.
We're going to come back to this, but I want to go to you, Rosetta, real fast. One of the things we talked about previously was kind of level setting and where people are. Can you talk more about what that means?
Absolutely. I think that we oftentimes feel like everyone is in the same space as it relates to this work, and that is absolutely not true. And I think that the first thing we need to do is think about it from our own self-value. How do we value diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? And once we do that within our internal work, then it is, how do we then create that space within the institution or the organization? I think it is a disservice if you don't have that value to think that it can be created within an institution. The second part that I think we should all think about is the history of education in this country. It was never intended to be inclusive. We think about Harvard, 1600 was when it was founded, and it took 200 years before the first Black student graduated, and that was from Middlebury College. Then Harvard, 200 plus years, graduated the first Black student. And so we have to think about that. That was never the intention for education to be equal. And so there are legal and civil actions that had to happen in order for that to be created. The next thing I want us to think about when we talk about how do we get to this belonging and inclusion is, how can I change this space? And how do I interrupt or disrupt what this current environment is? And we talked about this last night, is that most of these institutions are founded, still run by white men. You have on your table there some statistics about administration and how it looks for higher education in general. And that is 2019. So when we think about these things, we have to think about, it was never intended for it to be inclusive, but now we're here, and this is what we have to do to change and disrupt the space.
No, I think that was really well said. I don't know if AJ, you have any additional context there that you want to add?
I think this is just a really good opportunity to plug one of the resources that we talked about, and I've already had them write that down in our notes, but one of the books I highly recommend, my institution just finished a reading project on this, it's called Becoming a Student-Ready College. And so it really flips the model on its head exactly to what you're talking about, right? Where it's less now about how do we prepare our students for higher education, and it needs to be more about how do our institutions prepare for the wide range of students that are going to be accessing higher education, right? And so it flips the model on its head, and and I like that model a lot, especially in the DEI&B space, because so often the onus is on the students, right? And the onus is on marginalized and minoritized communities just in general, right? Learn to adapt, right? Learn to be resilient, right? Learn to assimilate into this culture, right? And we talked a lot about this as we were getting ready today too, that's sometimes the struggle with the concept of belonging, right? Where, oh, well, I need to change who I am so that I can adapt and belong in this space, right? And that's not what I want people to focus on when we think about belonging, right? Belonging should be about how do we as an institution, how do we as a higher education structure do better at making sure that our students, with all of their diverse identities, all of their backgrounds, all of their experiences, are able to cultivate and really foster that strong sense of belonging within our institution and within every layer of that, right? The peer-to-peer social belonging, right? The classroom engagement with faculty, the policies and procedures and structures that we have across the institution. And so becoming a student-ready college, I think is just a great reading opportunity for institutions. And if at the very least, even if you don't read the book, just really starting to flip that model on its head. And instead of saying, how do our students do better at our institution? How do we do better for our students?
One other point I wanted to bring to the discussion, and I think it's really critical and important, is, and we've talked about this too, we talked a lot last night.
So much.
And this morning. But I think it's really important as we think about diversity and what that means. And when we think about the intersections of it, right? We talk about diversity, and because of the construct of the country, we always think about race first, right? And we think about gender. And even within that, we are not being inclusive because we think about race and we only think about black and white because that is the construct of our country. But we have to think about all of the other ethnicities and races that exist and that are marginalized. And then you go to the next level. You think about gender. You think about how that is being transformed as well, sexual identity and orientation. Think about ableness, right? I remember being on or moderating a panel, and the person shared with me personally that they were losing their hearing. I never even thought about that. And so I said, okay, well, you sit in this seat so you can see everyone else be able to read their lips and understand what is going on. I'll remember to repeat certain things so that you can hear and understand what's going on. So think about ableness. The one area of diversity for me is always about thought. Because when you come to the table and everyone has a different perspective, the way in which you have critical thinking and problem solving is phenomenal because we're not homogenous and we all approach things very differently. In my classes, I hate group work. I'm just gonna be honest. Oh Lord, it's being recorded. Edit that part. But I don't enjoy group work, but then I do, right? Because I then learn that other people think very differently and it brings a different perspective to the discussion and the way in which we approach our work. And so I've learned to appreciate it. So, but that diverse thought is very important, and certainly in higher education. One other example, and then I'll give it back, is whenever we would have our larger meetings before, someone used this and I'll credit her. Her name was Deborah Hurd. She said, BC, before COVID. Before COVID, in our respective institutions, we get together in large groups and have all of these great conversations. But every time we would do that, everyone from advancement would sit together. Everyone from marketing would sit together. Everyone from admissions. And I used to be, okay, you know what? I see you people all the time. I'm going to go over here and mix and mingle with these other folks, find out what their work is like and how my work can influence theirs or their work can influence mine. And so it was, for me, very, very informative to learn what is happening in admissions, what is happening with recruitment, so that then I can go back to my group. Did you know these things are happening? And so I think we really need to think about that in our spaces. And now with Zoom, you can do it very easily, and you don't have to be sitting next to the person, but at least you can have that conversation.
And I think what Rosetta, like, that's so important, because one of the things we've talked about that we really try to focus in on in our work is institutional transformation. So how do you get beyond one good actor who is trying to do good work on their own, trying to carry this out as their own initiative, and it's something that we talked about yesterday, I think, and we've certainly thought a lot about in our work, and how do we get this to be institutionalized? Like, how do we get this to be an institutional priority? So I think the different departments sort of working together is really a key part of that, and I think the importance of leadership in that can't be understated. So, the buy-in from leadership, how do you get that? How do you work with high-level administrators to make sure that it becomes a priority? What are the policies that could be changed in order for it to be a priority? Such as, one of the things we think a lot about is our sort of classroom interactions and classroom environment that professors are cultivating. There's not really an incentive for professors to adapt some of these context-focused interventions if it's not part of the requirement for their job. So how do we change the policies so that it does become a requirement for them, so that they do see themselves as culture creators, which they very much are, right? Like, I think it's really important that administrators and faculty see themselves as culture creators and know the importance of student experience, because we've seen, decades of research have shown the importance of the student experience in terms of their ultimate outcomes in higher education.
AJ, I'm going to come to you real quick. You have a DE&IB model. Do you want to share that?
I think that was sort of my answer to the, what is belonging concept, and it's very much about what Rosetta said earlier too, about belonging being the outcome. Right, and we both said, diversity is a fact, right? You can't really deny that diversity exists, right? We have different identities and backgrounds, right? So I love people who are like, oh, well, I don't believe in diversity. Okay. That's an interesting place to start the conversation. Let's do that. Okay, because I do hear that sometimes, right? Like, oh, well, we don't need this diversity stuff. I'm like, well, it's here. Like, we need it. We don't need it. It exists. We can't really, fight against that. And I think, a lot of times, I think it's Arthur Chan is the author who has that. There's a great meme that circulates a lot, and it's diversity is a fact. Equity is a choice. Yep. Which, creating equitable opportunities, right? Creating level playing fields, helping people overcome barriers, right? Giving people what they need to be successful, right? Choosing equity is a choice. Like, we have to choose to make our systems and our processes equitable. Inclusion is about action, right? So being actively inclusive. And a lot of times in inclusion, I talk about that in terms of decision making, right? Who is included at your table when important decisions are being made about your department, your college, your division, whatever level of higher education you work in? Who's included at that table when those important decisions are being made? And really thinking about that question and asking yourself who else needs to be at that table, who, especially historically, has not been at that table, right? And then belonging is the outcome, right? Belonging is sort of what culminates after that. You'll see a lot of models that'll show it as a Venn diagram. It'll be like diversity, equity, inclusion, and then in the center is that belonging piece, right? So a lot of times I have, administrators who will ask me, well, how do I get there, right? Like, give me like a playbook, right? Give me step 1 through 7 of this is how we do belonging. Y'all, if I had a playbook, I would be a millionaire by now, right? Like, if I had a magical playbook that told you step 1 through 7 of how to get to belonging, great, right? And we talked about this last night too. We gotta keep saying that because we had so many conversations last night. But for me, belonging is so individual, right? Like, we have to respect the fact that not every single one of us in this room is going to define and cultivate belonging in the same way, right? And that's okay. And I think, again, that talks about that flipped model of, right, how do we create our spaces where, whether my definition of belonging, your definition of belonging, definitions of belonging that don't use the word belonging, right? That we say, like, no, we don't want to use that word, right? How do we create spaces that allow all of those aspects to feel like they're an important contributing member of our community and of our organization, right? Knowing that that might look different for everybody, right? And not just assuming that we know what each individual person's going to need in order to cultivate that strong sense of belonging, right? And I think that's really where, the importance of leadership comes in higher education, not just assuming we know the answer, right? But really listening to our constituents and, trying to build those spaces that allow everyone to cultivate the sense of belonging that works best for them.
Chris, you talked about the context of belonging, and maybe you can share a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Sure, and I think it piggybacks on what we've talked about a little bit here and my previous comments about the culture creators on a campus. And, our work has certainly evolved. Again, I think I mentioned our organization is really founded by researchers and social psychological researchers specifically, who really wanted to translate their work into higher education. So, I think at first our big project was a direct-to-student intervention focused on social belonging, right? And over time, and I wasn't with the organization at the time, but this was a big randomized control trial, worked with 20 plus institutions across the country. And there were certainly a meaningful impact of that intervention on students' outcome, their ability to see some of the issues that they'll encounter as normal and solvable, and helping them to access resources that they may not have otherwise have done had they not taken this intervention. But that, I think the way that we've grown over time is seeing that that's almost a last step in this, like working sort of the direct to student route. The context is really key. The environment that they operate in is really key, because what if a student gets a sort of belonging message and then they try to access a resource and it completely negates the message that they received through the intervention, right? The context has to afford them the opportunity to feel a sense of belonging in their environment. So how do we go about that? Like, what I mentioned the policies before. What are the practices and what are the communications that a campus is providing to students? So our next project really focused on communications, specifically to students who are on academic probation. And we did a ton of research showing that a lot of times the messaging provided to those students was really shame-inducing and really stigmatizing for those students. So how do we change that so that they see that this is a process? Do not create a sense of shame and stigma among these students, but see it as this is something that they're going through right now. There's a way out of this, and you don't create that sense of shame where they might withdraw. And they might not access the resources that might help them get back on track, right? So the importance of messaging. And I think that translates to course syllabi and other messaging that students receive. How do you really create what we call psychologically attuned messaging to those students? And it translates also to the classroom environment. So now we're more focused on a big project that we're working on is more on sort of classroom interactions and the environments that professors are creating, specifically in STEM subjects. Because I think a lot of times, I think there's a perception that in STEM, there's a sort of, there's I don't know how to phrase it, but essentially there's a mentality that you should be able to overcome all barriers in the pursuit of, a certain type of degree. We talked about this yesterday where, I went through it. There's a mentality in certain subjects where I went through it. So why shouldn't these students be able to go through some challenges as well in getting their degree? So the classroom environment that a professor creates is so important. So we've done work on professors adopting a growth mindset within the classroom, especially as it relates to their perceptions of their students' abilities, right? Not having a fixed and the importance of growth mindset as opposed to fixed mindset for professors. There are also just more interventions in terms of first day of how do they set the first day of class? How do they write their syllabi? So context has many layers, policies, practices, communications, but these are really important in terms of creating the culture on a campus. We try to think of it as a culture of belonging. And then that last layer, sort of going directly to students, we see that as sort of like once that culture is created, then sort of working with the students in terms of providing them with support as well. So I think that's how we sort of evolved in our thinking, and really emphasizing the role of culture and the culture creators, who are the administrators and the faculty, as well as the guidance counselors.
all of you have kind of alluded to this concept of power and privilege and how it exists. So maybe we can take a moment and pause and explain what do we mean by power and privilege and how does that exist on a college campus? I see a lot of heads nodding, but I don't know who wants to take that question.
We're all like, yeah.
Okay, I'll start, but you have a great take on this too. I think I'm not going to say what we do, but what we've talked about is that everyone has a space of power and privilege, and it is how we utilize that power and privilege in those spaces. I think that one of the examples I gave is that the best example of power and privilege that I saw was in the hearings for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. And Cory Booker, in that space, spent all of his privilege in that he defended her in a way I had never experienced for a Black woman who is beyond qualified. I don't know if you all have seen the meme that's going around, but how she checks every box compared to all of the other current sitting justice. She checks every box, and others only check one, only check two, but not all. But Cory Booker, in his defense of her, was the greatest example of spending privilege that I've ever seen. And one of the things that I've said is, whenever we're in a space, it is all of our responsibility. We talked about this as well, is that when you have that value and understanding of what this work means, then that becomes the accountability piece. How do you not only hold yourself accountable, but how do you hold others accountable for it being inclusive, for getting to the belonging outcome? And he did that in that moment in a space where he is a part of the marginalized group, but he recognized his power and spent his privilege for her. And for me, I literally was in tears about it because as a Black woman, I've experienced that same sort of abuse in the workplace. And she had to sit there and endure that. And for him to come to her defense in a way that I, again, have never seen, I thought for that man to do that in that space showed everyone in that room that this is how you spend your privilege. Whatever that privilege is, hold everyone else in the space accountable and don't allow these type of things to continue and go on. And for me, that witnessing that on that stage, I literally was in tears over that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think it's a great example. And I think privilege is one of these terms that we need to take a step back and define a lot of times as well. As we talk about that level setting and understanding that everyone's not necessarily at the same level of understanding when it comes to a lot of the DEI and B concepts. Privilege is one of those hot button words, right? A lot of times you say privilege and you can feel it in the room, right? Half the audience is like, what do you mean, right? Immediately into this defensive space, right? And because privilege has been misconstrued, right, over the years, it has this really negative connotation to it. And people feel really offended when you say, oh, well, you have privilege, right? But to Rosetta's example, right, privilege is so situational, and we all have power and privilege in different ways based on different aspects of our identity. And we may walk into one situation and have privilege. We may walk into another situation, still the same person, but not have any privilege in that situation, right? Privilege does not mean that you've never had to deal with anything difficult, right? Privilege does not mean that your life has been easy and that everything in the world that you've always wanted has always been handed to you. That's not what privilege means, but that's what it's been turned into, right? It's turned into this whole thing of, oh, well, I've had to deal with so many difficult things in my life. How dare you say I have privilege? But that's not what privilege actually means. Privilege is just saying that there are certain things that you may not have to worry about just because of who you are, how you identify, how you walk through the world, how you present yourself, right? I walked into this building today and I didn't have to worry about whether or not there were stairs. I didn't have to worry about if there was an ADA button that was going to automatically open the door for me, right? I was able to go to the restroom, and there's universal restrooms here. Shout out to the organizers. Thank you for picking a place with universal restrooms, right? But that's something that I have to think about every place I go, because as a trans non-binary person, I don't like to use gendered restrooms because it's weird and it's awkward, and I'm tired of people talking to me in the bathroom and asking me why I'm in there. right? Like, I'm sorry, I'm trying to pee. Like, thank you. Like, I love that this is being recorded and I just said that, but right, like, this is a real conversation I've had to have with people all the time, right? If you can just get up and go pee anytime you want and never even have to think twice about it, that's privilege, right? Privilege is so situational, and it can be simple things, but it can be really powerful things, right? Even being a black male, right? Knowing that there's tons of marginalization and minoritizing that happens to black men in our country and around the world, but in that moment, he recognized his privilege and was saying, I'm going to use that in that moment as a powerful move to help elevate somebody else, right? And that's the key though, right? Is using power and privilege in strategic and effective ways that elevate others and don't overshadow others, right? We were talking about this. Omid asked us a great question last night as we were thinking about the panel, and he was saying, well, I'm an administrator, right? And AJ says something in a meeting and he misses it, but then Chris repeats it and he's like, oh, Chris, great idea, right? That thing I talked about with belonging. In that moment, you know, his responsibility as the administrator is to, one, try to avoid doing those things, right? But it's also Chris's responsibility in that moment to say, well, I'm just repeating what AJ said 5 minutes ago. AJ, can you elaborate on that more, right? Kicking the conversation back to me, not necessarily then going off on his own tangent about the conversation, right? Because he was able to get the attention in that moment, right? But kicking the conversation back to the person who originated the idea to give their voice an opportunity to be shared, right? So it's using our privilege and power in strategic ways to help elevate those around us and use our privilege to sometimes help people who don't have the same privileges as us in that moment.
The one thing I would add is that, AJ, you alluded to, you know, the importance of recognizing who's not in the room, right? And I think sometimes it can be difficult to recognize the privilege and power that we may have, right? And I think like this sort of underscores the importance of diversity as we're all thinking about how to create more equitable learning environments, how to make sure that we avoid you know, having blind spots in terms of elevating different voices among our student body and making sure that we are truly creating equitable outcomes and not just for a certain few. So I think like it's really important. We for example, do a lot of designing of context-based interventions. So we can't do that with a bunch of researchers in a room, you know, without having administrators at the table, without having a student voice at the table. You really have to think about who is a part of these conversations in the design of this work, as well as the execution, and also the importance of getting feedback, you know, to make sure that you're utilizing that feedback to really get at the aim that you're hoping to address.
I want to move this a little bit towards, I am a university administrator. I want my students to belong. What should I do?
Here's the playbook, right? The step 1 through 7. Right, yeah, the magical play. Y'all, we need to get together and write this playbook, and then, you know, we'll be millionaires. So the thing that I always start with in this conversation, because this gets asked all the time, right? Well, what do I do, right? What's step 1? Where do I start, right? I think that the true key to effective DEI and B work and creating that ultimate outcome, that ultimate goal of belonging, is holistic integration of DEI and B into your institution, right? So this cannot be these random isolated DEI and B efforts or programs or initiatives that you're like, oh, we're gonna do a DEI and B strategic plan. I get calls all the time asking for a DEI and B strategic plan. I will totally sit with you and help you write a DEI and B strategic plan. However, I would rather help you analyze your existing strategic plans and figure out how do we integrate DEI and B priorities into the strategic plans that you are already doing, right? And that's where the key is, especially in administration, right? When we think about policies, when we think about procedures, when we think about the practices that we have, how do we look at every single aspect of our organization with a DEI and B lens and see how we can incorporate DEI and B more holistically into each part of those pieces, right? So if we think about recruitment, right? Okay, let's look at recruitment through a DEI and B lens, right? Recruitment of students, recruitment of staff, recruitment of faculty, recruitment of senior leadership, right? That's usually where the fall comes in, right? The recruitment of senior leadership. How do we look at our recruitment practices with an emphasis on DEI and B and improve upon our recruitment efforts in that way, right? Then how do we think about onboarding, right? And orientation for students and onboarding of new faculty and staff. Then how do we look at retention efforts with that DEI and B lens? How do we look at promotional pathways, professional development, tenure processes, right? Chris gave the great example of faculty, right? We do climate study after climate study after climate study, right, in higher ed, and then the data sits and we don't do a lot with it, right? But over and over again, the data shows us that the faculty interactions for students are so critical in the DEI and B space. They know there's staff, right? There's multicultural centers, there's all these different places that they can go to for staff support, but they interface with faculty so much more in the classroom. How do we help integrate DEI and B into our faculty processes, our tenure processes, our promotion processes? Do you have DEI and B priorities in your faculty handbooks, for example, right? And how do we help our faculty integrate DEI and B into the classroom? And we could do whole entire trainings on just that topic, right? Incorporating DEI and B in the classroom is not just about, well, I need to have a diversity lesson, right? I'm gonna call AJ and have them come in for one 50-minute session and we'll talk about diversity, right? Again, it cannot be an isolated island by itself. DEI and B has to be integrated into the fabric of what you're doing, including the classroom setting, right? And then as we think about all of the other aspects of the student life cycle, the employee life cycle, how do we integrate DEI and B into all of that? So if you wanna do a DEI and B strategic plan, let's do it. However, again, I'd rather let's look at the existing strategic plans, right? We all have 500 of them, at least my institution does, right? How do we look at all of those and integrate DEI and B into that so that it becomes an integral part of the fabric of our institution rather than these isolated instances and these isolated initiatives that are not going to give you long-term sustainable success?
And what I'll add to that is, in addition to that, because I wholeheartedly agree with all of that, is that we have to make sure that the work is not just focused on the brown and Black people or the traditionally marginalized or historically marginalized people, because we're doing a greater disservice to the dominant groups if we don't focus on them. And so when you have these programs and you have these initiatives, it shouldn't just be targeted toward those groups. We're already marginalized. We know these things are happening. So it is, let's educate the rest of the group, the dominant group, onto these things of they don't have an understanding of it. And so how do we create that awareness and bring about that education so that everyone understands where we are in this space, and how do we then move to all of the things that AJ just mentioned of being more holistic in how we approach this and how we dissect what is happening on our campus. And I think the other piece to this is that many people, senior administrators, presidents, they want to be performative in the work. Oh my gosh, we have to do DEI. We have to do, what is doing DEI? What does that even mean, right? Unless you are having this holistic approach, we're going to do it, we're going to check the box, and we're going to say we're diverse. Well, when institutions contact me about these things, the first thing I do is go to the website. Okay, you're diverse, huh? I don't see a brown or Black person in leadership anywhere. And I'm just looking at it from the surface, right? But what else does that mean for you as an institution? So that's the first thing, is define what that means for your institution, because unless you understand what it means for your institution, there's no way that you're going to be able to address the issues. All of the climate surveys that are being done, are you looking at that data and really trying to understand what that data means for your institution? Because trust, it is not the same for this institution as it is for that one. And so I think that is what we have to make sure we're focused on as well, is defining it first and then starting to educate to become holistic in how we approach it.
And piggybacking on Rosetta's point about the climate surveys, I think we need to see some of these student experience measures as outcomes in and of themselves, right? And not just a sort of linear focus on academic outcomes, but what are the student experience outcomes? What are the metrics? And collecting that data in a meaningful way, and really utilizing that to learn for learnings among administrators, staff, and to develop improvement plans in terms of improving the student experience for all students on campuses. I think oftentimes and again, like we do know that student experience, there is a meaningful relationship, a significant relationship with academic outcomes. But I think like even looking at them themselves, so social belonging measures, there are many others that are really meaningful for the student experience, and we know there are different assessments that campuses can take. But I think really focusing, I think there's a really important argument for the data targeted towards student experience, and making that a meaningful part of a campus improvement plan and campus learning in terms of development plans for faculty as well as administrators.
And just if you want to add anything that you think students should do, how do students know and how do they push the campus and how do they know, what are the definitions of belonging that a student should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think students are very astute in this space, and they are pushing the narrative. They are forcing a lot of these institutions to do what I just said, is recognize, what does this mean for this campus, and how can I help you understand, going back to the equity conversation, what my individual needs are. You think about community college campuses, I know some of you are represented here, those are the most diverse campuses in the country, in the world, because you have different age groups, you have veterans, you have first gen, you have socioeconomic. And so those students are coming into this space saying, well, hold on, I have a different need than this other person. There's a great TED Talk, Dr. Anthony Jack, he's at Harvard, and it's called Access Ain't Inclusion. And he meant that when he said ain't, with his educated self. But he speaks to this whole notion of, you recruit these Black and brown students or marginalized students to come to your campus, get them there, you get the numbers, and you're good on that front. But then they get there and they are like, what is supposed to happen now? And he talks about not having the same understanding, the privilege of other students who understand that, oh, there's this thing called office hours where I can go and talk to my professor and get a better understanding of what's happening in class. If you haven't seen it, you should, because it really speaks to how we have to understand, once a student gets to the campus, that's not it. We have to figure out, how do we then encourage and understand their needs to get them to matriculate and be successful as a whole person when they leave that institution. And oh, by the way, our institutions would be better for it, right? Because if I have a great experience at your institution, guess what I become? A great alum. I give back, I participate. I want to help other students come to your institution because I know you're going to treat them well. But if I have a horrible experience, guess what I do? Do not go to that institution, because they don't see you and they don't really care for you. So I think the students are pushing this narrative and really saying, no, I have a different need over here, and I need you to address that and speak to that.
And I think it's really important for, again, the culture creators to allow students the opportunity to contribute their voice to what are their needs and how can we improve the campus environment, like really getting the student voice involved in that. Now, not all students are going to participate in this, right? Like it shouldn't be incumbent on every student to try to create a better sort of campus environment. But I think some students will certainly lend their voice to helping improve the campus structure. And I think we have to be receptive to that. From the administrator side, from the research side, I think we have to make a meaningful outreach to students in order to make sure that their voice is incorporated in the work that we do.
Yeah, and I agree, absolutely. And I think a big piece that students really help with is identification of barriers, right? And so, I think that speaks very well to what you both are talking about. But, what are the barriers that are preventing you from being successful? What are the barriers that are hindering your ability to cultivate that strong sense of belonging here, right? Because sometimes we don't know, right? Because our experiences are different than what our students are experiencing. And every individual student is going to experience different types of barriers, right? But being able to identify those barriers by giving students those platforms and then being able to address the barriers instead of addressing the individual students, right? Because that's when we start to talk about systemic change, right? If I'm targeting every individual student who's having, financial aid challenges, right? Okay, I'm every individual student who has financial aid challenges, which is like everybody, right? Because it's difficult, right, to navigate the financial aid universe. And so if I'm targeting each individual one and trying to, play whack-a-mole essentially, getting every single issue, if we start to really think through that strategically and systemically, we're noticing all of these students from all of these different groups, right, are having this same financial aid issue, right? How do we as an institution then respond systemically to provide resources, services to address that issue so that we don't have to play whack-a-mole with the 500 students that have the problem throughout the year, but we're addressing the problem itself, right? And I think this is, if anyone's seen the image, and it talks about equality versus equity, and it has the people standing on the boxes. Are we familiar with this? If you're not, I can show you later, but it's equality is giving everyone a box, right? Equity is giving people a number of boxes that they actually need to see over a fence. And then there's another version of that image that has a third box, and in the third box, they take away the fence, right? And so that's really where institutions need to be thinking, right? So it's not about giving everyone the same resources, and sometimes it doesn't even have to be about giving everyone the resources that they need. If we just remove the fence, like nobody needs the boxes to stand on anymore to see over top of it, right? And that's really where that systemic change, I think, comes into play. And I just wanted to just highlight one thing Rosetta said too about retention over recruitment. Because retention and recruitment go hand in hand a lot. There's directors of recruitment and retention, right? And we have these recruitment and retention strategies, and it's all about numbers. It's all about demographics. It's all about who are we getting in the door. In my opinion, and in my experience in higher ed, you have to focus on retention first. And institutions never want to do that, right? Because they're worried about numbers. They're worried about demographics. Well, we need more of X student, right? Our numbers are terrible. We need more of X student. But if you're just going to bring them in, right, to Rosetta's point, and it's going to be a revolving door where one semester later they're right back out again, right? Retention and student success have to be your first priority. Because once you have strong retention and student success initiatives, and your students who are there are able to be successful, persist, retain, graduate, right? Cultivate that strong sense of belonging, then you can flip the model and say, great, let's focus on recruitment and bring more of those students here because we know we have the systems and structures in place for them to be successful, right? So recruitment, in my opinion, has to come first. I'm sorry, retention. Don't do that. Yeah, so retention has to come first, yes. Has to come first.
We want to open this up to questions, but before we do, I want to touch on one last topic, and that is allyship. Maybe you can take a moment and explain what does it mean to be an ally?
You have the mic?
Oh, that's the problem with the mic, right? So I think this goes really well with our conversation that we had about privilege and power, right? Using our privilege, using our power in situations to be effective allies. And allyship has that same potential pitfall that we talk about just generally with DEI&B efforts where it can be very performative, right? It's very easy to say, I'm an ally, I'm a supporter, right? I'm looking out for XYZ marginalized or minoritized community and I support you, right? It's a completely different thing than to actually put those words into action, right? And so our allyship has to be very active and very action oriented. And again, I think that's where a lot of the power and privilege conversation comes in. Even if you don't have a super high ranking position in higher education, right? At every individual table, at every individual decision-making point, you have some sort of privilege at some point, right? And there's a way that you can elevate and use that privilege to help elevate the voices of people around you. And that, I think, is really effective allyship. And we have to create those opportunities for equity, for inclusion, right? Making sure people are invited to the table, making sure people are present during decision-making processes. But I think effective allyship also means being able to step up in those spaces when things don't go the way that they're supposed to, right? Because I think that's where allyship really goes to the next level, but that's the part that gets really difficult for people, right? Well, I can be here to create opportunities that are positive and inclusive, right? But what if you encounter an opportunity where someone's not being inclusive, right? What if you encounter an opportunity where there are microaggressions taking place, right? Or there's bias at play and you can very clearly see what's happening, right? Getting comfortable addressing those pitfalls that happen. We're all human, we all make mistakes, right? These things happen all the time. Being able to address the negative things that happen will help you take allyship to the next level. If you're creating those positive situations, great. But we also need to step up in that space when things aren't going the way that we hope they will.
I think she said it all.
Yeah, I was gonna say plus
These
1,000.
days,
Yes.
Excellent. So, one of the things Rosetta had mentioned is the importance of a microphone. So if you have questions, it's important to use a microphone. And I said that in jest, but this is actually a really important point. I see this a lot of times at conferences where someone say, oh, my voice carries, so I'm not going to use a microphone. It's actually not about you. It's about the people in the audience, and they need to hear you. And in the context of this, because it's being recorded, we need you to use the microphone so that we can hear you.
I'll say, having been a senior administrator on campuses where this has happened, number one, it is one of the most disheartening things that can happen on a campus. But then the response, when it's not adequate, is just unbelievably disappointing. And so as a senior administrator, and I was one of two Black senior administrators and the only female on my campus. And when we had this incident that happened where Black Lives Matter poster was posted and it was defaced, and the response was not at all adequate. And so what I did in my privileged space is that's where I started having the conversations of, it's really important that we address this in a way that speaks to the entire campus. Don't just bring the students who had the poster put up because they were meeting and having an event. Yes, address them and speak to them and understand what their concerns are, but let's make sure we're talking to the entire campus because this impacts the entire campus. And then how do we address that as a campus? And one of the things that we did at the time, and I was raising my hand to say, let's bring in someone to come and talk to these students about what has happened, and then how do we then address it? And I can't say that it was as adequate as it should have been, but it was ongoing that they were trying to address it and rectify it. But to your point, there were students who were just like, yeah, I won't support this school, because they didn't feel like the response was, number one, quick enough or adequate in how the administrators responded to it. So you will lose people in that regard if you don't address it. I think you have to address it immediately and with the entire campus, not just the group that was offended, but everyone needs to be a part of this discussion and come up with what are the solutions for our campus. Don't put the onus on the people who are marginalized to address it. That is critical in the entire situation. I didn't create it, so I shouldn't have to make it right. And I think that is what institutions need to do when they approach it.
And so often you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? And I think Rosetta speaks to the immediacy of which you have to respond in a thoughtful way, obviously, but like you do have to address this and you have to get comfortable having these types of conversations on your campus. So I'm always in favor of creating spaces where, again, we were talking about the student voice earlier. There are ways to, have safe spaces for students to discuss these types of issues when they occur on campus. Think obviously meaningfully about who a facilitator could be in terms of that type of discussion. But I think creating those types of spaces is very healthy for a student body. Another thing, and it's by no means comprehensive, and I think it's a guide, it's a resource that we try to provide with some of the campuses that we work with, but because of the number of these types of incidents that happen. We created, and again, this is a collaboration between researchers and administrators, we created a guide for addressing identity-threatening incidents on campus for administrators, right? And again, you need more than just a guide, but at least there's a meaningful way to address these and create those safe spaces for students, as I mentioned before. So it's something we're certainly trying to think of on the research end, like what else can we provide to campuses as these, because I think oftentimes people just don't know how to address these things. So if there's any guidance that we could provide, we try to do that in the support that I mentioned. But I also think the importance, as I mentioned, of creating those safe spaces for students so you can hear their voices and hear their concerns when these things occur.
Just real quick, just to add, I agree with everything that you both said, and I think it's just really important to be very intentional about the language that you choose when you address these things, and you know, when instances happen that are very clearly wrong, right? So often I find administration trying to be diplomatic, right, and neutral, right? Like, oh, well, there's this, you know, thing that happened, and, you know, I'm sure there was crazy chaos on both sides. Like, no. Like, some instances, it's very clear something was done, and the thing that was done was wrong, and we need to say that, right? And, you know, there's the lovely cliche phrase, you know, when you stay neutral, you're really just siding with the oppressor, right? When you stay neutral, you're not actually neutral, right? You're just letting the oppressive behavior be oppressive, and you're not doing anything to combat it, right? So it's actually not neutral. It's the worst thing you can actually do, right? And so I think it's just really really important to be intentional about language. And I think it's very telling, you know, even when we saw the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, right? And even just talking with administrators about those instances that happened in that moment, and the way that the you know, the emails went out, right, or whatever, and it was like, the incident that happened with George Floyd. What, right? Like or even just like the death of, like, that is a very telling way to talk about what happened, right? The murder of George Floyd, right? The murder of Breonna Taylor, right? It tells people everything they need to know about your viewpoint on that situation just by changing one word in that sentence, right? So we have to be very intentional. And when bad things are happening, it's that allyship piece, right? When things are happening that are not okay, we need to call them out and say explicitly that they are not okay.
And while we go to another question, I don't know if there are other questions. One of the things I might add to that is, what are you doing right now? You know, a lot of times people wait till after the fact and then try to come up with some kind of diversity. And if you look at organizations who've actually done, like Nike's a good example, actually. Nike's had some pretty good scandals when it comes to issues of race and gender. And generally they still are seen as a very proactive company, partly because this is what they do all the time. And so companies who struggle are usually reactive rather than proactive. So I would say you should be active right now. Don't wait till there's a problem, because you're never gonna have the perfect response. It looks like we do have a question we'll go to here.
I'm understanding it correctly. It's similar to the work I used to do with alumni engagement. And it is creating opportunities for them to engage in a way that is beneficial amongst themselves. I'm guessing that's what you're speaking to. And one of the things, I know exactly what you're talking about, and you know, having it be an online space is difficult in itself, right? And the adjustment to the online space. But one of the things in my last institution that I recognized is that we didn't set the framework, right? We say, okay, all of the Black alumni, this is your group. All of the Hispanic alumni, this is your group. Women, this is your group. Push them into that, and then what? And so what I realized early on, I said, well, what are we asking them to do? So we had to set the framework for them. This is how we want you to coalesce. We give them these opportunities to engage on whether it's professional level, social level, because again, speaking to the equity piece, everyone doesn't have the same need. Even though we're all Black or brown or we're all women, we don't all have the same need. And so setting up excuse me, a framework that works for every individual within that space, and then they can coalesce around the topics that make sense to them, the interests that make sense to them. And so we had to do that. We set up professional opportunities, social opportunities, networking opportunities, and then we created dynamics for them within those spaces that they can opt into or opt out of. I think everyone was becoming zoomed out with some of these things. When it first started, everyone was gung-ho, but then after a while, it was like, yeah, I'm not doing another Zoom, I'm sorry. And so we then started to make it fun. We would do different activities that were just fun and ways for them to interact that didn't cause them to have to think. that's a bad way to phrase that, but you know what I mean, not be very intellectual. When I show up, I might have a drink in my hand, but I'm just here and I just want to be social for the moment, you know, those kinds of things. And so you have to set the framework. You can't just say everybody coalesce and go and do. You have to set a framework for them and be really structured about that. And I can give you more information about that, but you have to set the framework and then have goals for them and how they interact.
I talk about this with my faculty a lot because a lot of my courses, I have a very diverse discipline college. So we do a ton of different types of majors in the college that I work in. And some of our majors are more strict than others with things. And one of our majors is a studio-based major, and they were very much attendance policy, right? Like you have to be here every day, right? And if you miss 3 classes, you fail. Like that's it, you're done, right? Pre-pandemic, BC. And so post-pandemic, they voted as a faculty to get rid of the attendance policy, right? To say, well, if you miss 3 classes, you don't automatically fail the class. But it all harkens back to the learning objectives of the course, right? And you said you work in accessibility. So this is what we talk about a lot in the accessibility space too. It all has to tie back to the learning objectives of the course. Do I need to be physically present every single day in person in the course in order to achieve the learning objectives? Arguably, maybe, right? It depends on the course. It depends on learning objectives. But if you can't make that argument, right, how do we build in flexibility and options for students that allow them to still meet the learning objectives of that course, but do it in a way that accommodates for all of these other things that are going on, right? And so we're not automatically failing students for not attending, but like our studio-based major as my example, students still have to check in with their professor, right? So maybe they don't have to be in class every Tuesday and Thursday from 8 to 11, right? But they have to then make a point to go to office hours. Or we have like open tutoring studio sessions. They have to make a point to try to come to something like that. Or they have to meet through Zoom with a professor and have that conversation. And they have to stay on top of their work, right? So they still have to meet deadlines, right? They still have to turn in assignments. So our studio major has still been able to be very successful. And this was a huge switch for my faculty, right? Because they were like, no, everyone needs to be here. And if you're not here, that's not it. But they found that they could still meet the learning objectives of the course by adding these other components in. And it didn't necessarily mean that every student had to be present for every single hour of the studio course in person. So I think the learning objective piece and figuring out how many different ways can faculty meet the learning objectives that allow for options and flexibility for different types of students, that's really what comes into play. And I think this comes in a lot with the DEI&B trainings I do for faculty. We talk about equity in design, right, and universal classroom design, and giving those menus of options and different ways for students to achieve the same learning outcomes. That's really, I think, the future of higher ed. That's where we're going to need to all be moving, right? Not expecting everyone to learn in the same way and achieve the objectives in the same way. I think that's the direction we all need to be heading in. And I think that really thinking about the learning objectives and getting creative with that is a good way to start that conversation.
I think that's where the innovation piece is going to come in as well, because no one is going back to normal. Let's be clear. We were never normal to begin with. Let's really think about that piece. And so no one is going back to normal, certainly not students and how they want to learn. So institutions, from the earlier conversation, have to be innovative in how they recruit and retain and engage these students, whatever way that may be. All of the things that AJ just shared, it is on the institution to figure that out. And how do you connect with the student in a way that will cause them to want to be a part of your institution? And this, you have to be here every day in person. No, just no, that is not going to be the way in which people want to engage. And so institutions are going to have some really, really clear conversations about how do they innovate going forward to educate.
Synthesize everything that we've heard is hard because there's been such a wealth of information and knowledge that our guests have very generously and gracefully shared with us. For me, a couple of ideas that are still sort of dancing around my mind is just this notion and understanding of privilege. which I really appreciated the way you defined it. It's just basically not having to worry about things and recognizing how common that is and how that's contextually defined. And the fact that a lot of the work that we're going to be doing is an active strategy. It has to be proactive, it has to be intentional. And interestingly enough, and I give Erica credit for this, but sometimes stepping up means stepping back to listen. I think, Jenny, to your question, if you're finding things aren't working, what are the strategies that we can employ to just hear from the students themselves what their experience is like? So for me, there's a lot of golden nuggets that I'll continue to sit with and digest and hopefully be able to implement in the work that we do. But with that, again, if you'll join me in thanking the panelists and the moderator.